Hey everyone, welcome to the Human Cloud Podcast, the spot where leaders come to drive the freelance economy forward. So today we have Jason Posel, CEO of Greenlight.ai. This episode is very much about the topic, meaning classification. So classification is one of those things that when you get excited about the freelance economy, you don't go, wow, I cannot wait to get into employment law. It's just not. But it is by far one of the leading blockers for freelance adoption at scale. And by adoption at scale, we mean 50 million plus a year spending on freelancers with a large pipeline. So what is classification? As you're going to learn, classification is literally just defining the person you're hiring as a W-2 full-time employee or an independent contractor. And there are massive implications if you do not get classification correctly. So the reason that this episode is so important right now is because there has been legislation recently, and this is where Jason's going to be the expert, recently put into place that makes classification a whole lot harder and a whole lot more impactful. So enjoy the time with Jason, then go drive some change. Jason, all right, man, listen, so this is kind of an interesting episode in terms of it's going to be less about you and more about let's talk through classification and what's been happening the last couple of weeks. So to kind of frame this, you know, we've known each other for a while now, but when we talk about classification, it's one of those issues that is totally not sexy, but very, very impactful and very powerful in scaling a freelance workforce. And so there's been multiple attempts at classification in the US. There's been the PRO Act, there's been AB5 in California, but it's a very confusing area. And so instead of me trying to educate our listeners, I'm going to be super lazy and I'm going to give it over to you because Greenlight is, one of the leaders in terms of classification, whether it's Fortune 500s or whether it's the marketplaces themselves. And you correct me. So let's start with give a little overview of Greenlight, and then we'll get into what the hell is classification, what's been happening recently, and where is it going.
Awesome. Thanks, Matt. Good to chat with you again. So Greenlight, little overview on Greenlight. We, as you say, help large enterprises and talent organizations with compliance, onboarding and paying workers. Should sound simple enough, but when you're dealing with contractors, it's not, right? There's a lot of different issues. And one of the core compliance issues that we help companies with and that we deal with, that we're experts on, as you say, is this issue of worker classification, right? Which is really the core compliance issue as it relates to the freelance economy. In other words, is someone who's working for you as a freelancer, if you're a freelancer, should you be treated as an independent contractor, a 1099, or as an employee? And both of those two different frameworks for engaging a worker have very, very meaningful and material differences in what the implications are. If you pay someone as an employee, then you're responsible for a whole set of labor laws, right? Whether there's rules around overtime or time off, how you treat the worker and so on. In addition, it also means that you'd be responsible for paying them and social security contributions and maybe benefits and so on. In many cases, that's the preferred relationship. In many cases, it's not necessarily. To be a freelancer, there's no rules. You're paying a business. That's ultimately what it means, right? Freelancer typically, Matt, what is a freelancer? What's a freelancer? Let's define that.
Well, okay. So I think my question to you is going to kind of help define that. And my question is going to be, what have we done prior? What I mean by that is the idea of external talent, right? Right. So I think that's the question that's gonna help kind of answer this, because listen, we've had companies have been either 20% plus or even over half contractors or external talent for over 50 years. So freelance is nothing new. So
I would say forever. I would say forever.
So forever, right? We can get super geeky and talk about the original definition of free and then lance, right? Going back to Knights, but we won't get too nerdy there. But so Jason, what have companies done prior, right? How have they been solving for classification for the past 10, 20 years?
Yeah, so it's a great question, because the reason this is topical now, right, is the US Department of Labor just last week came out with their final rule, which is going to be effective on March 11th, which is to do with the FLSA, the Fair Labor Standards Act, and it basically governs every rule around who's an employee, but also they seek to define who is an employee and make that fairly broad, right? They want to capture as many people within that as possible. And so actually, these rules have been around forever in every country pretty much, right? There's some definition of who's an employee within the law. Now, what's super complicated in the US is that you've got federal law, but even at the federal level, and so this, again, we're going to get into a little more detail about what this new rule is. But even at the federal level, the FLSA, which is from the Department of Labor, who meant to represent worker rights and how you treat your employees, is not the same as the IRS. That rule hasn't changed. IRS have their own rule. Then you've got the states, right? Every state has their own rules. Fortunately, most states, the rules over determining who you have to treat as an employee versus an independent contractor are actually not as onerous as the federal, but there are some exceptions, and some of them are the biggest. California, Massachusetts, for example, where they have what's called the ABC test. And again, we can cover that briefly a little bit later. So firstly, these aren't new. The DOL are seeking to make it easier, in their words, to analyze if a worker should be treated as an employee or as an independent contractor. And so let's just take a step back as why, right? Why is this an issue? So the first point is that the government does decide legally. There is a legal definition, and you can't just decide, I want to pay someone as a freelancer. Why? That is looked upon as, well, are you just doing that because you don't want to pay taxes and deal with labor law and the FLSA, for example, right? You can't just say, I don't need those rights. And so that's where it starts. It's very much driven for two things. Government collects Social Security, that's it, and income taxes and so on, right? Mainly through employers. And so that is the biggest driver. They want to continue collecting that money. They would prefer people to be employees. It's easier to collect money for them. Secondly, they also are worried about worker rights, that workers are not abused in whatever way by the companies they're working for. So in other words, you can't just say, I'm not going to give you overtime or pay your Social Security because I don't want to, right? And you should just agree with that, otherwise you can't work for me. So that's why these rules exist. And the fact is that for small companies and small businesses, it's seemingly less meaningful because the risk is perceived to be much lower. And they may not know about these rules because it may never impact them, although increasingly it does impact people. But certainly for larger organizations, whether that's an enterprise who uses contractors, freelancers throughout their business, as you know, in every part, right? From their marketing people to like their landscaping, everyone. Could be 50% of the workforce is not their direct employee. Doesn't mean those workers aren't employees, right? They're probably just employee of a staffing organization somewhere down the supply chain, right? And so that's how often large enterprises deal with when they want to use freelancers, how they manage and mitigate their risks around doing this. So again, let's take a step back. There are rules around who's an employee, who's an independent contractor. These new rules are seeking to define that, make it easier to define what that is. We'll go through that. Government really would prefer people to be employees. And it's essentially based on this new rule, what they call the economic reality. In other words, they basically work for you or not. That's what they're saying. If they work for you, not for themselves, then they're an employee. And the government have introduced 6 factors under this new rule that we're going to go through in more detail about how like any company can practically do that. Again, large enterprises have to do this at scale and rely on their own supply chain, their vendors, to manage many of these compliance issues. So that's different. And again, if you're a Uber or a Lyft, then obviously this is like your business model. So it fundamentally affects it as well. So I think if you look at small businesses versus large business and then companies who are just built on the freelance model, it has a different impact on all three. But certainly this is making it harder and just reinforcing existing rules, right? To make that clearer that you can't just say someone's a freelancer and not pay tax.
So there's like 3 different directions that we could go. I think let's clearly define what companies have been doing traditionally And the buzzword to me is EOR. And so would that be the default situation, or what are some of, say, the top three strategies slash providers slash solutions that companies have traditionally been using?
Are you talking about large companies or?
Yep, yep. Well, let's talk. Let's. You know what we're gonna do? Let's define it by spending $1 million plus on external talent. I think that is how we're going to define it. Not number of employees. Let's just go with: is there a more than $1 million spent on external talent? If yes, then you'll fit into the bucket that we're talking about.
Got it. So the way that, so those that care about compliance, let's define it as well, right? Should we throw that in? Those that actually understand the rules and want to protect their company as a result, right? Proactively deal with that. So there's three main engagement models that they use. They may still use freelancers as independent contractors and have an internal process where they'll have someone internally, maybe in legal or HR, who's reading through these DOL rules, who's going to like this when we get into some of the more practical stuff, right? About what does this mean? But there's probably someone who's going to sign off on every independent contractor, right? And say they are or they need to be employed now. If they determine they need to be employed, the model for that, if they found the worker themselves, is to use an EOR, an employee of record. So that's typical in a large program. That if they are using their own talent acquisition to identify freelance talent, then there'll be someone typically who engages that worker as an employee if that company thinks that worker needs to be employed because they don't fit the criteria to be paid as a 1099 independent contractor. The third, and actually probably most common as you get bigger, is that these companies use staffing companies to find the talent, and they also make them responsible for compliance, right? So in other words, if you're a talent marketplace or a staffing company and you want to go and sell to Microsoft, Google, whoever it is, they're going to have like a lot of rules that they're going to pass on to you, not just about the quality of the talent that you're finding and how you have to operate with it, but also how they're paid. So they basically force these companies to employ the workers. That's why historically, at the large contingent workforce programs, most contractors are employed by a third party, which is either an EOR or a staffing firm. So they're typically employed by them. And really the biggest change we've seen like over the last 10, 15 years of that is for some of those companies, there's more emphasis on providing a good experience to that freelancer after they've got placed at that company. In other words, try and make it easy to get paid and get benefits and stuff, right? So there's a bit more focus on that rather than just you have to be a W-2, you'll get your, we're sending out tax forms now, right? End of the year for everyone, like so thousands of people. That's like millions of people across the US are paid through staffing companies who are not, that's not who they're actually working for, but on paper, either way, they're operating as the employer of record.
Yep. So now let's talk freelance. So this is where I think we've now come to intersection. So, just to kind of summarize. So these companies have been using external talent forever, right? This is nothing new. They've been doing it with three ways. Either internally, someone is there checking if this is, or signing off on this is actually a 1099 or they need to be an EOR, or they're forcing their staffing providers and their external talent providers to have the coverage, be it indemnification as well as the compliance checks. So now freelance comes in, and the promise, and this is where I'll give you what my definition of freelance is, that it is, and the definition is going to sound a little weird, but it is digital mediated sourcing where you still see the whites of the person's eyes that you're working with. Now, digital means they're coming through some sort of digital platform. Whites of the eyes means that the match is typically the person that needs the work, not someone who's sitting in HR generally. And so it's a quicker way to get the talent that you need. Now, it's kind of, in a lot of ways, it gets looked at as a shortcut and an alternative with the existing procurement and TA processes, because we know that within these companies, it takes 3+ months, and that's giving them a lot of grace in that number. It takes 3+ months to find someone, if you can even find that person. Yet on these talent marketplaces, there's 800+ globally, and so there's a surplus of really, really good talent. And so, these end users, meaning CMOs or the people in the working teams, they hop on these platforms, they find the right person in under 5 days, and they go, wow, this is a totally different experience than what my internal processes would have given me. Now, here comes the challenges you were talking about. If that marketplace is not educating or has not planned for compliance, then that end user, meaning the CMO or the person at the enterprise, is on the hook for the compliance risks. And so it's okay when you have one freelancer, but when you're scaling a freelance workforce, this gets really dangerous, right? And really potentially getting sued for a lot. So this is where freelance kind of F's it up, right? In terms of, oh no, everything was working, but then now we enabled these digital marketplaces, and the end users, meaning the CMOs or working teams, have power that they hadn't had in a long, long time. But now we kind of have to hone it in because the government's saying, whoa, 33 million freelancers means that only 1/4 of you all are going to pay us our 7% payroll tax, and that can't happen. So, quick question before we hit on this recent legislation, Jason. What is the global implications of this? And I ask this actually like really wanting to learn myself, because there is not a good answer that I know of, okay, let's just go hire Latam. Let's just go hire freelancers in Europe. Let's just deal with not hiring anyone in the US, and we then don't have to deal with any US government classification risks. But so can we hit the head on that question, and then we'll get in. But so yeah, why not then just hire freelancers globally?
So you can, and plenty of companies do, right? And obviously during the pandemic, there was a massive behavioral change with companies being much more open to bring down borders, which they should. But even then, depending on the country and depending on what you're doing and what talent you need, there's still rules in every country. Like, that doesn't mean just because you go out of the US that all of a sudden there's no tax law and companies don't want to collect taxes from the workers in their location. So I think that I would look at it differently. I think that if you're a company that is using freelancers and you're starting to scale, then if you haven't known the rules, then they can certainly appear onerous. They are onerous and counterintuitive and expensive. But the fact is that most businesses just have lots of employees, right? And they're used to dealing with that. And so there are lots of ways to manage it. I mean, that's what we do. We make it easy for our clients to do that. So what does it really mean for a company, the impact of this? Primarily, it's financial. It means that if you've paid someone as a freelancer and you haven't paid taxes, like employment taxes, there's going to be an increase in cost of like 10, 15, 20, 25%. But that's because you haven't been paying taxes.
Yeah.
Right. So
And
I
the
know
laws,
it seems harsh, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and the laws are typically less favorable globally than they are in the US, right? The US for the most part, yeah, from my experience. But no, tell me more.
Not really. No, it depends on the country. It really still depends on the work that's being done. I think that's the biggest focus, right? So it's less about the country and more about what are you using this freelancer for? Why do you, right? And that's part of like, what is the definition? So if you've got someone who you're using essentially full time, like, that's not really a freelancer, right? And so again, you can use that label. And I think this is where things get confusing. Large talent marketplaces like that, let's say like Uber and Lyft and some of the delivery companies who have their model is based on these workers being freelancers, being independent contractors for two main reasons. They want to avoid the taxes because that would make it much more expensive, which means, you know, if the cost to get an Uber goes up 20%, that's impactful for people who ride Uber, right? And they're probably going to ride it less. And so they're trying to avoid that. Plus, there's other labor law issues that would then apply to. They have to provide benefits. They have to provide overtime or time for when they're waiting and so on. So they have a very big vested interest in these workers being treated as independent contractors. But that also means that they've conflated and confused other people where the use cases actually are not as complicated, right? And so that's why actually the government have done a good job in one sense of like trying to like make this clearer. But if the intention is to use someone, so there's two sides, right? Yeah. To really, what is a freelancer legally? It's someone who is actually operating an independent business, right? You can be a one-person business. That is, again, Matt, nothing new, right? self-employed, sole proprietor. It's called different things in different countries. Through right, freelancer, Freiberufler in Germany. Right, these are not new terms. And it's really about what is the nature of the relationship that you're trying to have, right? If someone's out there hustling and they're like, they're trying to build a business and they've got like 5, 10, 20, depends what they do, different clients. If you're a freelancer and you're selling your lance, right, to the highest knight, to the highest lord as a knight, right, and you'll go, like, literally, you don't have a job. But if all of a sudden King Arthur offers you a full-time job, so now he's got to pay tax because you're an employee all of a sudden, right? If he says, I want this to be an exclusive relationship, or I want you to do most of your time, and don't worry, now you don't need to go and buy your own armor, or like we'll give you like all your equipment now. Now all of a sudden, right, this relationship's changing. Actually, it's quite a good example there. Hadn't actually considered freelance, the origins of the term before, but it's actually a really good example of like you can talk that through, right? You can see there's different ways that someone can be treated who's doing that same role. Yeah, go ahead.
And the problem that's made it so complicated, back to what is different about freelance is the reason we use, digitally mediated is just because it's become so easy to have a one-person business. It's become so easy to have a B2B professional service business, whether you're a designer, an accountant, a consultant, whatever it is. But to your point, you had said if you have 5 to 10 clients, the ideal service-based business, if you're a one-person business, is 2 to 3 clients, and 2 to 5 maybe pushing it. So where it gets complicated is, you might be making 300 plus having one freelance client. You still might be working 30 hours a week with that one client. It gets sticky. So that's where it gets really complicated, is it's now so easy to have a one-person business. But that doesn't necessarily mean you have 5 plus clients. You might only have 2 clients and you're happy with that.
That's right. And so, every circumstance is different, right? And it is different. And that's, when we look at worker classification, we have to look at every single scenario, right, on its own merits. And there's always 2 sides to that. What's the nature of the work, right? Yeah. In other words, like with the company who's hiring, what are they looking for? How are they going to treat this worker? Like, are they going to expect them to turn up on site for the next 6 months or a year full time and not work for anyone else and be totally focused and do meetings, or are they expecting them to they're going to pay them when they like deliver the content that they need, or write the report that they're expected to do? And so that's the first part. But the second part that the government says in the US and in many other countries, but like US, the UK, for example, Germany, and so on, certainly developed countries have pretty detailed rules around what they expect. They also expect the worker to act, or at least try and act, as an independent business would. And what does that mean? That means things like investing in their business. That doesn't mean having a laptop, right? That, like, again, it's hard. This is where it becomes harder to actually qualify. But it's not all casual, because they're saying there's multiple factors, right? But for example, if you have your own office, not home office, but let's say you rent somewhere, and maybe you have an assistant, or actually you have a partner, or whatever it is, right? It doesn't have to just be you. And you've got costs, you've got rent and other things like that, right? It's different to just having a license. It depends on what that business is and so on. Are you advertising? Do you have a website, or do you just go on, a site, a digital site, which is super easy, and that's how you find your work. And so all of these different factors have to click to that.
And let's so this will be super helpful for the next 15 minutes. And so, because we're going to talk about, right after this question, we're going to talk about, okay, what is this new legislation? What do the leaders need to know? But I think, it'd be helpful, Jason. How do you make your money? And I ask that because we're going to see how, and I think I know this, so I apologize if I'm wrong, but you're incentivized to not F up classification, because if you F up classification, you're going to end up having to pay the bills for your clients. That'll then sink you. Am I wrong in saying that? Okay,
no,
perfect.
You're not wrong in saying that.
Perfect. So no one, so no one is more incentivized to understand this legislation than you. So what the hell happened the past couple weeks, and why are we now talking about, and why did I, hurriedly email you on Friday morning saying we need to hop on the pod because what's going on with classification?
Yeah. So the government, the federal government did come up with it under the Trump administration. There'd been a loosening of the criteria to qualify as an independent contractor, and that's basically been rescinded by and those rules are coming in on March 11th. And so they've made it harder in many ways to qualify for a business to pay someone as an independent contractor, even if they're doing freelance work for them. That's the bottom line. They've assumed what's called the economic reality test, which is like what we kind of have been discussing. It's around, what is the actual economic reality of the relationship, and they introduced 6 key kind of issues to look at to assess that, right? How do you determine? What does that practically mean? Like, are they economically dependent on you or not, right? And so they've given more guidance to that. You want to go through those?
Yes, that would be. And just quick question before. I mean,
sure.
Maybe this is just beyond the scope of. Maybe this is beyond scope, but like, how did they do this so quickly? Because the states have their own, like AB 5, you name it, right? But the PRO Act, they were trying to pass the PRO Act, which the PRO Act would have done the same thing that we're talking about, from my understanding. And now all of a sudden, in the matter of days, we hear, hey, in March, whatever it is, March 1st or March 11th, these are the new rules. How does that now become a law without any?
This wasn't a new thing.
It's so confusing.
It wasn't a new thing, actually. The government have been talking about this. They actually enabled anyone to make comments and participate in their process of evaluating and so lots of people were involved in contributing to that conversation from all sides. You can imagine the lobbying from all of like the marketplaces and so on. Was I would imagine, I have no insight, but I would imagine pretty intense. But what they basically did was just say, look, these rules existed before. They're actually going back to what they call judicial precedents. In other words, every time the courts have ruled on this at the federal level, it's come back to these same things. And so again, all they're doing is saying there was a little gap for a few years under the Trump administration where it was a little easier, and we're just going to go back to what it was essentially before that. And here's the guidance on how you should know. And what I would say is it's still not as onerous, for example, as we said before, as California or Massachusetts, which both have what's called the ABC test. You have to meet all 3 of these 3 specific criteria to be paid as an independent contractor. Before we jump in, I just want to take one step back and just say something that we haven't really surfaced here, which is, for me, freelance it's kind of a state of mind as well, right? It's like independent. If I'm looking at it from being a freelancer perspective, it means I want independence of some kind. But that also is very easily conflated and confused with being a 1099 or a W-2. Not everyone wants to actually be a 1099, nor should they be, right? It depends on how much you earn and what you're trying to do. And if you're trying to operate as an independent business, some people just want to have 1 or 2 clients, right, where it's steady and they do the same thing all the time. That's 2 part-time jobs, right? You can call it freelance, but it's right, actually, according to the law, and it's always been the case, right? And certainly, before freelance became a cool term, people always had part-time jobs, a second job, and things like that. Didn't make it freelance, any of that, right? To be clear. So what it's not, it may have an impact on people wanting to be independent, how that operates. I think there's a lot of scare around that because you can still get a job at one of these great, we have many marketplaces. So if you're a great marketeer, for example, you could go onto several different marketplaces and you'll get jobs, but they might be 40 hours a week for the next 6 months. You'll work on a really cool project at some super cool tech company, and then you'll get another one, and you'll have this consistency of getting work for different places instead of being stuck at one company which you didn't want, and maybe they wanted you on site. So you can still have a lot of this independence. I think that's what's so empowering, but it's also been conflated with, as we're talking about, these rules don't prevent people from being independent. It's going to just penalize financially the companies who use them, because if you have, that's where we talk about, right, you've got to pay your social security, your FICA, and FUTA, and state unemployment insurance. Yeah. So people shouldn't be too scared. The main impact is on companies who are flouting rules when they know, we've got 20 people. Oh, Jimmy, he's been sat here for 12 years. We pay as an independent contractor, right? he's always been an employee, Jimmy,
Yep.
in that case, so
Yeah.
all right.
So is it reasonable? Yeah. And is it reasonable then? Because it said, I mean, this is not a political show in any way. We have an election coming up, right? If the current party stays in place, we can assume this will stay in place. Whereas the next administration, can we assume that they'll go back to what it was pre-Biden administration?
I mean, I don't know, right? That's that's a political process to get there. But all I can say is, like, looking at the timing, though, it's not going to be quick, right? Like, it's taken Biden's administration this long, right now. So whatever it is, this is definitely going to be the rules for the next couple of years. And either way, you still again have to you have to look at your state rules as well, or if it's internationally, what the rules are there.
Yep.
And in most cases, we're talking about the edges, right? That's why you have to look at every single case on its own merits. But for the most part, we can look at general rules, right? Again, if they're working essentially full time for you, they don't have other clients, they have to show up themselves. You're paying them hourly, right? This looks like employment, right? Or you're paying them a fixed amount, right? And they're basically working 30, 40 hours a week for you. Like, this is, for the most part, going to be considered employment. Go ahead.
Let me ask very simple questions, and I'm asking them purely because this is some of the FAQs we've heard from clients. So if I'm a company based in Texas paying a worker in California, I still get in trouble?
Yeah, it's where the worker's based. So
it's where the worker's based. Perfect.
That's their own tax residence always. So it's always where the worker is doing is, and when I say based, where their main place of work is, right? So if they live there, but they have to come on site,
gotcha.
They're flying in, that's different. Then that's going to be their main place of work. That's where their main place of work is.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, that's. Let me shelf that question. Second question. This is now federal, though. So what we're talking about right now is at a federal level, not at a state level.
Correct.
Okay, so now let's get into it. Let's get into what changed, and where is it going? And you can pull up, Jason, if you want to pull up if you want to screen share this part, this is where it'd be super helpful.
Yeah. Okay, give me one sec. Figure out how to.
And before you do that, Jason, what are you seeing? What are you seeing early signals in terms of the enterprise reaction to this? Is there a reaction to just stop hiring freelancers? Is there a reaction to lean into partners, new types of partners? What's been the initial reaction from enterprises?
I think it's totally business as usual for enterprise. Like I said, it doesn't really change things except at the margins for some workers. It's more if your business model is based on independent contractors, then this is probably more problematic, because the federal government's definitely going to be looking at companies who have large-scale use of contractors. But if you're a large enterprise with a contingent workforce program, you've already got vendors who are indemnifying you against this risk. Your vendors, for the most part, will say, all right, well, we think they're employees, and if we thought maybe they're an independent contractor, now we're just going to make you a W-2. If you want this gig, we're going to W-2. And then there's still benefits to that, right? Like, because probably now you get access to some other things in terms of employee benefits that you wouldn't otherwise have got. It's better than going through, the marketplaces and things like that. So there's definitely benefits for people to be W-2 for a gig like this. Again, if we're talking about someone who's really freelance, then it's not going to impact them either, right? If they really are freelancing for multiple clients. So let's just start with, here's the rule. We're not going to go through it all because, as you can see here, it's 106 pages. Fortunately for you, we have been through it. But also the federal government...
Then I have to pay you as a professor, Jason?
Well, not me, but...
Then you get adjunct fees.
My team, yeah. They have created an FAQ on the Department of Labor site, as you can see here. It's still a lot of info, but the most relevant part is, I would say, a few things here. If we just go down, if we start with, where's the rule? If we start here, so they've essentially introduced these 6 factors, which starts at number 13, about who is an independent contractor versus who is an employee. How do you actually assess that? So let's just hit the first one, right? And this will, I think, really help, Matt, for you to understand. Right, none of this is really real. But you have to assess these things. So opportunity for profit or loss, depending on managerial skill. And they highlight, so this is this one we're looking at here, and they highlight a number of different factors around what that means. Essentially, if someone's being paid a fixed amount for fixed hours, or maybe if you work a few more hours, you get paid a few more bucks, right? Because we're going to pay you per hour. There's no opportunity for profit or loss, right? Profit or loss is, as you know, when you've got your own expenses and you've got to deliver something to someone or a client or whatever that is, and maybe you're going to make money or maybe you're not. Your margins can change and they can fluctuate, and that's going to depend on your managerial skills, on how you make judgment around how you spend your time and how you deliver and have you advertised, right? And all these other things. Do you have rent? And these are the things that they're looking at, right? So we can go through a number of things, but that's what they're saying here. So like, do you market and advertise, right? How are you getting more business? Like, is that really...
That's interesting how they put that. Yeah, because I hear that, Jason, as are you outcome or project based, and then it dips more into the is this SOW work or right? So if you are SOW focused, now I mean here's 100%. the challenge, and you know I've seen every model in the freelance space, and one of the biggest challenges is deciding when it's best to be retainer versus when it's best to be outcome / SOW. And to be honest, the retainer actually works really well, but the retainer does look like a typical hourly engagement at times. And so you're saying, hey, you know, I'll give you 20 hours a week, and it does fluctuate up or down. That does work in a lot of spaces in freelance models. But so that's the first one. Let's go over to the second one.
So just like to summarize for this first one, right? And they're saying there's multiple factors here, the government, right? So it's not just this one. There's multiple things. They're going to look at the overall picture here. Yep. But it talks here even about, you know, if you take on more hours or take more jobs, we're paid a fixed rate per job, right? And so on. These are the sorts of things that they're looking at. That would indicate you're an independent contractor, right? If you're not, it looks like you're an employee.
Interesting.
So that's the first one. Second one, investments by the worker and employer. And here, what they're talking about in more detail, firstly, is obviously an employer, not obviously. If you're a small business, it might be different. And that's why, again, small business hiring a freelancer may be different than a large company. A large company who's made a lot of investment. Let's say you're hardware engineering firm, and you've got a bunch of hardware and all this networking stuff, right? Hardware and so on. And you hire a freelancer, but he's coming in, he's using all that equipment. Like, what's his investment in his business or her business there, right? As an example.
Gotcha.
So what they've talked about more on the investment is they do expect the freelancer to have an investment, but they also want to see that there's some sort of equitable investment. If one party has made much more investment, we can flip it the other way. You hire a plumber, and let's say, right, that plumber is likely to have invested in all the equipment. You're not going to have that, probably, Matt. I don't know. Maybe you're very handy, but otherwise you're going to expect that plumber to turn up with all the equipment.
We'd have none of that equipment.
Right. So you're going to expect the plumber to turn up with all of his or her equipment, right, for that same thing. So, but that's an example of, right, like they really have made an investment. That's truly a freelancer. When you hire that, and probably just add a few other things there, right? As we look at some of these other things here, they're going to have made some investments themselves, also probably their qualifications, which is one of the later ones. You're not going to be telling them how to work, right, or how to do their job, probably. It's definitely no degree of permanence for that. You're not no expectation of that at all. This is clearly freelance work, right? Like, that's really clear there as well. Okay, let's get into the degree of permanence, because that's the one that we just touched there. So again, it talks about factors in favor of being an independent contractor are the duration. So it's non-exclusive, project-based. Certainly, like SOW is pointing to a lot of this stuff, right? That they do this for marketing services to multiple entities and so on, right? Now, they talk about seasonal. There's, again, get more details. But when there's a lack of permanence, a perceived lack of permanence, that looks more freelance, right? If it's ongoing, you got that retainer every week, right? Where's your, like, this is looking less. So it depends. Again, you know, if you've got 20 clients, that's what I'm saying. That looks much less. If you've got 2 on a retainer where you've got fixed hours, it's looking harder to make that argument. And again, you can hear as we talk through that it's a very different impact for the freelancer than it is the business. For the business, the risk is really with them.
Yeah.
Right. That's why they care. And the bigger the company, the more they care. Nature of degree and control. Now, this is a really interesting one as well, because often this is where it gets to. Whether it's short-term, long-term, hourly, deliverable, how you control, how that company expects that worker to behave, right? Are you telling them how to do their work? If you give someone a manual, they can sit at home, and if you give them a manual to follow, that's not a lot of independence from what they're doing, right? That's a job. Even if you do it for 3 hours and that's it forever, that's a job, right? That was a job for those 3 hours. If you have a runway model and you tell him or her to walk this way and wear these clothes and so on, again, that might be for a few hours, but there's not a lot of independence in what they're doing. And they might even have lots of clients, right? And so again, they're going to look at all of these factors. But you're asking people to do stand-ups, right? And regular reports, and maybe they're acting as part of a team rather than acting independent, then that's going to indicate employment. And then there's a couple of other ones that are a little harder, we think, to interpret. I'm going to skip one for a moment and go to the second from last one, skill and initiative. So it is important. Let's be clear. If you're really skilled and like high level, it does have an impact. If you're lower skilled, it's much harder to make that argument, right? Let's be frank. Like, it's hard to argue that you're an independent burger flipper and go work for like McDonald's and Burger King and say like, I'm a freelancer here, right? I just do a few hours here and there, but this is what I do.
Yeah.
Right. Like, so it does have an impact. You're a professor or whatever you are, or you're a doctor and you do freelance work. Probably that's going to be very different, right? And so for that, maybe you've got a job one place and you're consulting on the side. And that's really, if you're really consulting, in most cases, if you're consulting on some sort of SOW, you are going to be a freelancer, right? Now, the other part that they talk about is, I skipped one thing. Being incorporated is very important, right? And it's not it's not listed that you have to incorporate, but they do say like that's looked upon as you're investing in your business. You're trying to run a business. It also gives some additional protection, which why it feeds into this last of the six indicators that they said. It gives some sort of indication to the client as well. But just setting up an LLC for your one client and just working there isn't going to work either, right? So that doesn't work. So the final one is it part of the employer's normal business? That's really hard, right? And where, like, that's hard to gauge. For example, if you're a large enterprise tech company and you're hiring freelance AI people now, who's going to say that's really not integral to your business? It probably is, right? And so that's increasingly going to be a hard argument to make in those cases. Yeah, sorry, stop there.
So if we were to summarize, and it was super helpful, literally just looking at that and saying, hey, here it is, here are the 6, and starting at 13. But if we were to summarize this, what we would say, that I'm gathering from the whole episode is, listen, freelance is nothing new. Freelance is having to grow up, though, in terms of it's having to start to have some consistent and standardized definitions, because we've built so many terms on top of freelance, right? Whether it's open talent, liquid workforce, on-demand talent, gig work, so many different terms. Just trying to define.
Hashtags are hard, right, Matt?
Now we're oh my God, don't get me started. And then we talk about what works best internally in these programs. So, do we call it a gig program? Do we call it a freelance program? So we talk about that. But the big insight is just that, whether it's current administration, new administration, left, right, middle, whoever's in place, there has to be a formalization and consistency of, we could call it organizing your freelance talent. And I would say my answer to this always is it comes down to having good partners. We fervently advise against having internal solutions for this. The only one that I've seen work well is Amazon, but it's because Amazon has so many factory workers that they can justify based off the volume. But so that's my main takeaway from you, is that this legislation it's always going to be uncertain, and it's always going to skew on the side of needing to formalize around the definition of a 1099 independent contractor. Poke holes into that, and I know we only have 2 minutes left.
So I'd look at it just slightly differently. I think there's two. This impacts companies in two ways. One, companies who use freelancers at any sort of scale that have not really paid attention to this. The same thing applies that I would have probably definitely would have said before this and said last time we spoke, which is they should, right? Like they should, but they also need to look at like what's their real risk, right? And balance that against commercial needs. They should probably look at implementing a program. Even if they do their own checks, right? They can figure out how to do some checks on this and just make sure if it's really, egregious, then they change, you can just hire someone as W-2. It's not the worst thing in the world. That's it, right? It's not the worst thing in the world to just W-2 them instead of 1099 them. I think for larger enterprises, it just means that, they're going to be looking at this closer and how their vendors do this. And if they don't have a good process, that's where there's friction, right? If they don't have confidence on their ability to bring in people who should be SOWs, because like we said before, plenty of people should still be freelancers and 1099. So they just need to have a robust process to get them in, and that means evaluating them, right, in an effective way. And there's lots of companies like us who do help enterprises do that. But that's the most important thing: making sure that the way that you evaluate and then engage your contractors is optimal, right? It deals with these things.
Yep. Listen, so Jason, this has been incredible. Most important is where can our listeners find you in Greenlight?
Greenlight.ai. Is that what you meant?
Perfect.
Not really?
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah. That that is it. Because a lot of times people are searching greenlight.com or something like that, and it sounds simple, but where can they find you? So that is perfect. This is obviously not the last time we'll talk about this, and there's going to be a lot of content for you listeners out there. We'll give you some links in the show notes to make sure that you're looking at Jason's content and making sure you stay up to date. But Jason, thank you so much for hopping on.
Yeah, just the last thing, Matt. We did actually put out a little blog post which I can share with you, which you can put in the notes of this, so that people could read it. It covers a lot of what we covered today.
Perfect. All right, man. Thank you so much for hopping on.
Take care, Matt.